Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The headlights of my 18-wheeler cut through the Colorado darkness like butter through bread. But they couldn't cut through what I saw that night on Interstate 70. They say every trucker who drives through these mountains learns the rules eventually. Some learn them the easy way, from whispered conversations at truck stops, from CB radio chatter that goes silent when you ask too many questions. Others learn them like I did. Before I tell you what happened, before I explain why I'll never drive that stretch of highway the same way again. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how truckers seem to follow patterns that don't make sense? Why they stop at certain mile markers for no apparent reason? Why their CB radios go quiet at exactly 2:47 a.m. when passing through the Eisenhower Tunnel? If you're listening to this in bed right now, pull your blankets a little tighter, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a warning. And now the story begins. My name's Jake Morrison, and I've been driving trucks for 15 years. Started when I was 23, fresh out of Denver Community College with a commercial driver's license and dreams bigger than my daddy's disappointment. That October night 3 years ago, I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from Kansas City to Salt Lake City. Standard run, nothing special. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The weather reports showed clear skies, which in Colorado means absolutely nothing. I'd driven I-70 through the Rockies maybe 50 times before. But this was my first time doing it alone at night during what the old-timers call the quiet season. That's what they call October through November, when the summer tourists are gone and the ski crowds haven't arrived yet. The thing about the quiet season is, the mountain shows its true face. No crowds to distract it. No constant stream of traffic to keep it occupied, just you, the road, and whatever's been waiting all summer for the witnesses to leave. I'd been driving since dawn, stopped in Kansas City for my pickup around noon. The warehouse guys were acting strange. Kept asking if I was sure I wanted to take the night route through Colorado. Jimmy, the loading dock supervisor I'd known for 5 years, actually pulled me aside. "Jake, you could wait until morning. We could put your load in cold storage overnight." "Jimmy, what's gotten into you? I've got a deadline." He looked around, made sure nobody was listening. "My brother-in-law drives for Swift. Says 3 drivers have gone missing on I-70 this month. All-night runs. All during the quiet season. Missing? They find the trucks, engines running, cargo intact. But the drivers?" He shrugged. "State Patrol says they probably got picked up by someone, but what? The doors were locked from the inside. Jake, CB radio still warm. Coffee still steaming in the cup holders. Like they just vanished." I laughed it off then, told Jimmy he'd been listening to too many podcasts, but his words stuck with me as I crossed Kansas, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. By the time I saw the Welcome to Colorado sign, the sky had turned that deep purple color that comes just before full dark. I pulled into the pilot truck stop in Lyman around 9 p.m. to fuel up and grab some of their famous chicken fried steak. The place was nearly empty. Just me and 2 other rigs. One belonged to an old-timer named Earl. Recognized his cherry red Peterbilt with the airbrushed eagle on the side. He was sitting alone in the diner, coffee getting cold while he stared at nothing. "Earl." I nodded, sliding into the booth across from him. He looked up, and I swear his face went pale when he saw me, like he'd seen a ghost, or maybe, like he was looking at someone who might become one. "Jake, you heading west tonight?" "Yeah, got frozen goods for Salt Lake." "Why?" Earl's weathered hands wrapped tighter around his mug. There were scars on his knuckles I'd never noticed before. curved marks, like something with claws had grabbed him once. You ever hear about the rules, son? What rules? He leaned forward, voice dropping to barely a whisper. The Interstate 70 rules. Through Colorado. We truckers have our own. I laughed. Come on, Earl, you trying to spook the rookie? You ain't no rookie, Jake. That's why I'm telling you. He glanced around the empty diner. Even Betty had disappeared into the kitchen. 23 years I've been driving these roads. 23 years of following the rules. You know how many drivers I've tried to warn in that time? Earl, 47 inches. His eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. You know how many listened? I didn't answer. 12? Jake? 12 listened. The others. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his shirt pocket. It looked old. Older than it should be. The edges were brown, like they'd been burned. Write these down. Follow them to the letter tonight. Earl, this is... Tommy Fredericks didn't listen. Found his rig jackknifed near Georgetown last week. Cargo perfect, not a scratch on the truck. Tommy's boots were still in the cab, both of them, with his feet still in them. My laughter died in my throat. Bobby Chen thought it was all superstition. His wife called me yesterday, asking if I'd seen him. State Patrol found his truck at the Eisenhower Tunnel, engine running. His dinner half-eaten. His shadow was still in the driver's seat. Jake, just his shadow, burned into the leather like someone had taken a blowtorch to it. Earl pushed the paper toward me. Write them down. Now. The waitress, Betty, came over with my order. She saw what Earl was doing and just shook her head, setting my plate down without her usual chatter. Earl's handwriting was shaky, but I could make out what he'd written. 1. Between mile marker 359 and 361. Never look in your mirrors for more than 2 seconds. 2. If you see a broken down white van near Vale Pass, do not stop. Radio for help, but keep driving. 3. At exactly 2:47 a.m., if you're in or near the Eisenhower Tunnel, turn off your CB radio for precisely 3 minutes. 4. If you hear children laughing on the CB between midnight and 3 a.m., immediately switch channels. 5. Never, under any circumstances, pick up a hitchhiker wearing a Denver Broncos jersey number 87. I stared at the list. Earl, what is this? Insurance, he said. Standing up, his coffee mug was still full, untouched. Steam rising from coffee that should have been cold by now. Just follow them. Jake, even if you don't believe, especially if you don't believe, but what are they for? What happens if... The mountain's been here longer than the road, Jake. Longer than Colorado, longer than America. We carved through its body, blasted through its bones. You think it doesn't remember? You think it doesn't want payment? Payment? Earl was already at the door. The rules are the treaty. Jake, break them. And the treaty's void. And when the treaty's void, he looked back at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, raw, primal fear. They take what they're owed. He left without another word. Betty wouldn't meet my eyes when I paid my check. As I walked to my truck, I noticed something else. Every other trucker in the lot was watching me. Not obviously, but in their mirrors, through their curtains, like they knew something I didn't, like they were saying goodbye. By 10:30 p.m., I was back on the road, Earl's list tucked into my sun visor. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the first snowflakes started hitting my windshield around Georgetown. My Freightliner Cascadia was running smooth, heater pumping, Jake brake ready for the descents. Everything normal, everything fine. The CB crackled with the usual chatter. Truckers warning each other about speed traps and weather conditions. Breaker, breaker. This is Moondog heading westbound at marker 240. Road's getting slick. Boys, take it easy. Copy that, Moondog. This is Steel Horse, eastbound at 265. Chains required after marker 259. Normal stuff. Comfortable background noise that makes the long hauls bearable. But I noticed something. None of the eastbound truckers mentioned anything about what they'd seen coming through. Usually, you get commentary. Saw a nasty wreck at marker 205 inches, or a state bear hiding behind the bridge at 198. But the eastbound drivers, they just gave road conditions and went quiet. I'd almost forgotten about Earl's list when my GPS showed mile marker 358 coming up. The snow was steady now. Those fat Colorado flakes that look pretty until you realize each one is making the road that much deadlier. Between mile marker 359 and 361. Never look in your mirrors for more than 2 seconds. Ridiculous, right? But something made me count when I checked my mirrors at 359, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and I forced my eyes forward. Nothing happened. See, just Earl trying to... That's when I heard it. A sound like metal dragging on asphalt, coming from behind me. Not just metal with weight behind it. Like someone dragging a shipping container with chains. Every instinct screamed at me to check my mirrors, to see what was making that horrible scraping sound. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, eyes forward. The sound got louder. Closer dot. My speedometer showed 45 mph. Safe for the conditions, but whatever was behind me was gaining. Fast. The scraping became rhythmic. Scrape, scrape, pause. Scrape, scrape, pause. Like footsteps. Massive, impossible footsteps. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, eyes forward. Something passed me in the left lane. In my peripheral vision, I could see it was long, dark, moving without headlights. The cab shook as it passed, like when another semi blows by you. But the sound was wrong. No engine noise. Just that horrible scraping and a sound like breathing. Deep, wet breathing through something that wasn't quite a mouth. The smell hit me next, roadkill and diesel fuel and something else. Something older, like the smell inside a cave that's never seen sunlight. The thing, because I couldn't call it a truck anymore, accelerated past me. I caught a glimpse of the back end. It looked like a standard trailer at first, but the doors were wrong. They were pulsing, breathing. And through the gaps, a red light that wasn't from brake lights. When I reached mile marker 361, I finally looked in my mirrors properly. Nothing. Empty road behind me, but on the shoulder at marker 360, fresh gouges in the asphalt, like something massive had been dragged across it. And in the snow beside the gouges, prints, not tire tracks, prints. Each one the size of my truck's hood. My hands were shaking as I reached for my coffee. The CB had gone quiet. Not normal quiet, but dead quiet. No static, no distant chatter, nothing. The kind of quiet that makes you check if your radio's even on. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife, he followed Rule 1. The voice was clear, young, almost cheerful, but there was something wrong with it. Like it was coming from inside the cab rather than through the speaker. And it had too many voices layered inside it, like a dozen people speaking in perfect unison. "Who is this?" I grabbed the mic. "This is Big Jake. Who's on this channel?" Static, then laughter. Not quite human laughter. It went on too long, had too many notes in it. "The treaty holds, for now, 2 more tests. Jake Morrison of Denver. 2 more tests before the mountain decides." Decides what? I keyed the mic hard enough to crack the button. Whether you're a guest or a gift. The snow was coming down harder now. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet. the kind of conditions where you white-knuckle it and pray. But I barely noticed. My mind was still on that voice. Guest or gift? What kind of choice was that? It was exactly where Earl said it would be. Vale Pass, mile marker 187. Pulled over on the shoulder with its hazards flashing. An older model Ford Econoline, the kind families used to take on camping trips back in the 90s. Faded paint, rust around the wheel wells. Normal, too normal. The hood was up, and I could see someone standing beside it, waving their arms. They were wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the reflective kind, safety conscious. Everything about it screamed legitimate breakdown. My foot moved to the brake instinctively. Every decent bone in my body said to stop and help. The snow was coming down harder now, and at this altitude. In this cold, being stranded could be deadly. The person was jumping now, waving frantically, desperately. If you see a broken-down white van near Vale Pass, do not stop. But why? It was just someone who needed help. Maybe Earl was paranoid, maybe... That's when I noticed the snow. It was falling everywhere except around the van, like there was an invisible dome over it. The person in the yellow raincoat, their breath wasn't fogging in the cold, and their jumping. It was too regular. Up, down, like a mechanical toy. I reached for my CB instead. Breaker, breaker. This is Big Jake westbound at marker 187. Got a broken down vehicle. White van, shoulder side. Anyone copy? The response was immediate, too immediate, before I'd even released the button. Oh, thank God, please. We need help, our kids are freezing. But the voice, it was the same person who'd been waving by the van. How were they on the CB and their voice? It was coming from behind me, but the van was ahead. And kids, I couldn't see anyone else in the van. Please! The voice cracked with desperation. My daughter. She's only 4. She won't wake up. Please. Just stop for a second. Everything in me wanted to stop. The parent in the voice sounded so real, so terrified, my foot hovered over the brake. Then I saw it. In my peripheral vision, the figure by the van had stopped jumping, stopped waving. It was just standing there. But its shadow was still jumping, still waving, like it was on a different timeline. I pressed the accelerator, passing the van at 45 miles per hour, a safe speed for the conditions. Not too fast to seem heartless, not too slow to, as I passed. My headlights swept across the scene for just a moment. The person by the van wasn't waving anymore. They were perfectly still, arms still raised but frozen mid-wave, and their face, God, their face was turned completely backward, looking at me even though their body faced the van. The smile on that backward face was too wide, had too many teeth, and the eyes, they weren't eyes, they were headlights, old headlights, dim and yellow, flickering like dying stars. In the van's windows, shapes pressed against the glass, small hands, dozens of them, but they weren't trying to get out, they were trying to get in. In my mirrors, following Rule 1. Quick glances only, I saw the van's hazards turn off. The figure hadn't moved. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, eyes forward. The CB crackled. He followed Rule 2. Smart boy. But the night's not over. The mountain's still deciding. Still weighing. Weighing what? I shouted at the radio. Your worth. Every soul has a price. Jake Morrison. The mountain just needs to decide if you're worth more alive, or as part of the collection. What collection? But the radio went dead. I tried to key up, but the mic wouldn't work. The whole CB was frozen. Display stuck on channel 19. Even though the power was on, that's when I noticed I was approaching the Eisenhower Tunnel. The clock on my dash showed 2:41 a.m. The Eisenhower Tunnel, 1.7 miles of engineering marvel carved through the Continental Divide. the highest vehicle tunnel in the world. At night, it feels like driving through the mountain's throat. 2:46 a.m. I entered the tunnel. The fluorescent lights made everything look sick. Yellowish, 2:47 a.m. I turned off the CB. The silence was immediate and oppressive. Just the echo of my engine bouncing off the tunnel walls. But underneath that, barely audible. I heard it. Whispers. Hundreds of whispers. Coming from the CB even though it was off. I couldn't make out words. Just the rhythm of urgent, desperate communication. Like everyone who'd ever driven this tunnel was trying to warn me about something at once. My speedometer started dropping without me lifting my foot. 65, 60, 55. The truck was slowing on its own. The whispers grew louder. I could almost understand them now. Almost. 3 minutes. Earl said 3 minutes. How long had it been? The clock seemed broken. Stuck at 2:47. The speedometer hit 35, 30, 25. That's when I saw them. People standing along the tunnel walls. Dozens of them. Men in trucker caps and flannel, women in outdated clothing. All perfectly still, all staring at my truck as it crawled past. 20 miles per hour. 15. The whispers were screaming now. I lunged for the CB power button. The moment it clicked on, the speedometer jumped back to 65. The people vanished. The clock read 2:50 a.m. Picked up a load of timber in Grand Junction. Normal CB chatter. Like nothing had happened. I burst out of the tunnel into the snowy night, gasping like I'd been holding my breath. The clock on my dash read 2:51 a.m. 4 minutes. It had been 4 minutes, not 3. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I pulled into a rest area near Silverthorne. Needed to walk around, clear my head. The snow had turned into a proper Colorado blizzard, the kind that makes you question your life choices. I stood outside my truck, letting the cold air shock some sense back into me. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe Earl had gotten into my head and I was seeing things. Yeah, that had to be it. The CB chatter had returned to normal. Truckers complaining about the weather, warning about black ice near Dillon. I climbed back in, determined to finish this run and forget about Earl's stupid rules. That's when I heard them. Children laughing. It started soft, barely noticeable under the static, but it was definitely there. Kids, maybe 7 or 8 years old, giggling like they'd heard the world's funniest joke. If you hear children laughing on the CB between midnight and 3 a.m., immediately switch channels. I reached for the channel selector, but the laughter grew louder, and now I could hear them talking. He's almost done. Just one more rule. Think he'll pick him up? They always pick him up. No, they don't. Remember the driver from Omaha? Oh yeah, they found his truck but never found him. More giggling. My finger froze on the channel selector. These weren't kids. Couldn't be. The voices were too knowing, too old despite their pitch. I switched channels. Silence. Then, you can't escape the last rule. Jake, it's already walking. I switched again. And again, every channel, the same children's voices. He's at marker 205. No, 206 now. Walking in this weather, he must be cold. He's always cold, that's why he needs rides. I turned the CB off completely. Screw the weather reports. I'd white-knuckle it to Salt Lake City in silence if I had to, but at mile marker 208, I saw him, a man walking along the shoulder, in a blizzard, at 3:15 a.m., wearing nothing but jeans and a Denver Broncos jersey. Number 87, every rational part of my brain said no one could survive walking in this weather dressed like that. But there he was, thumb out, ice forming on his mustache. The jersey looked brand new, like he'd just bought it from the team store. I wasn't going to stop, no way. But my foot hit the brake anyway. The truck slowed. "No," I said out loud. "No, no, no." But my hand was already reaching for the air brake. That's when another truck roared past me, horn blaring. The wind from its passage rocked my cab, snapping me out of whatever trance I'd fallen into. I slammed the accelerator, pushing past the hitchhiker without looking back. In my mirrors, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. He was gone, not walking, not standing. Just gone. The rest of the drive to Salt Lake City was quiet. No strange voices, no mysterious figures, just snow and road, and the growing dawn light turning the mountains pink, the aftermath. I made my delivery on time, grabbed a motel room and slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, I called Earl. "You followed them all," he said. Not a question. "Earl, what were those things? What's happening on that highway?" "Been happening since they built it. Jake, maybe before. The mountain doesn't like being carved through. The things that used to use those passes don't appreciate sharing with 18-wheelers. That's insane. Is it? You saw what you saw. The rules keep us safe, most of the time." "Most of the time?" Earl sighed. "Sometimes. Someone doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes the rules change. And sometimes..." He paused. "Sometimes the rules aren't enough." "What do you mean the rules change?" "Check your sun visor, Jake." I pulled down the visor where I'd tucked Earl's list. The paper was different, older looking. The handwriting wasn't Earl's anymore, but the words were the same, except at the bottom, in fresh ink. A 6th rule had appeared. 6, if you follow all the rules. Tell another. The mountain demands its stories be shared. My blood went cold. "Earl, I didn't write this." "I know, son. Neither did I when it appeared on mine 15 years ago. You're part of it now, part of the agreement." "Agreement with what?" But Earl had already hung up. "That was 3 years ago. I still drive that route. Have to. It's my job. But now, I carry the rules. And sometimes at truck stops in Lyman or Burlington or Grand Junction. I see young drivers heading west into Colorado for their first solo night run. I tell them about the rules. Some laugh, some listen. Most think I'm just another crazy old trucker with too many miles behind him. But every now and then, one of them comes back, pale, shaking, with that look in their eyes that says they've seen what moves in the darkness along Interstate 70, and at the bottom of their list. In handwriting they don't recognize. A new rule appears, different for each of us. The mountain, you see, it's always learning, always adapting, always hungry for new stories. Mine says to share the tale, so I have, but yours, well, check your pocket. That piece of paper you don't remember putting there? The one that appeared while you were listening to this story? Go ahead. Look at it, and remember, through Colorado. Truckers have their own rules. Now, so do you. Sweet dreams. And if you're ever driving Interstate 70 through Colorado at night, and you see a trucker flash their lights at you for no reason, just remember, we're trying to warn you. The rules are changing. And something's been following you since mile marker 359. If this story kept you up tonight, if you're checking your pockets right now, if you're wondering what your rule might be, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who drives alone at night. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the rules we don't talk about. Because I haven't told you about Interstate 80 through Wyoming yet, or Route 50 through Nevada. The loneliest road in America has its own secrets. And trust me, you'll want to know them before you drive them. Pleasant dreams, if you can manage them. Story number 2. They found my grandfather's journal in the walls of our old house in Roanoke last month. 40 pages of cramped handwriting that nobody in my family wants to talk about. The police returned it after their investigation went nowhere. Said it was just the ramblings of a confused old man, but I know better. Because I was there in 1987, and what happened then is happening again. If you're listening to this at night, alone, maybe check your locks, just to be safe. The story begins now. My name is David Mills, and I need to tell you what really happened in Roanoke, Virginia, in the summer of 1987. Not the version you might have heard if you heard anything at all. The real version, the one they tried to bury along with 17 missing people. I was 23 that summer, working at my uncle's hardware store on Campbell Avenue. It was one of those Virginia summers where the heat sits on your chest like a wet blanket, and the cicadas scream so loud you can't think straight. Everything felt normal until July 4th weekend. That's when Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down knocked on our screen door at dinner time. She was holding a casserole dish, which wasn't unusual, but her hands were shaking so bad the tin foil on top was rattling. "David, honey," she said, and her voice had this weird, hollow quality to it. "Have you seen the Johnsons today?" The Johnsons lived between us and Mrs. Henderson. Nice family. 2 kids, a beagle named Scout that barked at everything. I told her I hadn't seen them since the day before. "Their car's still there," she said, pressing the casserole into my hands, "but Scout's been howling all morning, and when I went to check..." She stopped, looked over her shoulder at their house. The front door was wide open, David. Wide open, but nobody's home. I remember the casserole was still warm. Tuna noodle. Mrs. Henderson's specialty. Funny how you remember details like that when everything else goes sideways. My dad and I walked over to check. Sure enough, the door was open, not forced, just open. Like they'd stepped out for a second and never came back. Scout was in the backyard, whimpering and pawing at the basement door. The TV was still on, playing the evening news. There were 4 plates on the dinner table, food half eaten. The milk glasses were still cold. We called the police, of course. Officer Reynolds came out, took notes, said they'd probably just had a family emergency. But I saw him taking pictures of something on the kitchen floor. Later, when I snuck back to feed Scout, I saw what he'd photographed. There were footprints in what looked like ash, leading from the dinner table to the back door. But the weird thing was, they didn't go outside. They just stopped. Right at the threshold. That was the first family. By July 10th, 3 more houses on our street stood empty. Doors open, meals abandoned, cars in driveways. No signs of struggle, no notes, no forwarding addresses. Just gone, like they'd been erased. The local news picked it up on July 12th. Mystery disappearances plague Roanoke neighborhood, they called it. They interviewed Officer Reynolds, who said they were investigating all possibilities. But I noticed something they didn't mention on TV. All the missing families had lived in houses built before 1920. All of them had basements with old coal cellars. And all of them had reported strange dreams to neighbors in the days before they vanished. Mrs. Henderson told me about the dreams over her fence while I was mowing the lawn. She said Mrs. Johnson had mentioned dreaming about people walking through her house at night. People who looked familiar, but wrong somehow, like relatives she'd never met, wearing clothes from old photographs. She said they were calling her name, Mrs. Henderson whispered, even though nobody else was around. Calling all their names, but in voices that sounded like they were coming from underground. That night, I had my first dream. I need you to understand something about old Roanoke. The city's built on limestone, riddled with caves and old mining tunnels from the 1800s. Most people don't know about the tunnels anymore, but my grandfather worked in them when he was young. Before they were sealed in 1943 after what happened then. In my dream that night, I was walking through my house, but It wasn't quite my house. The walls were the same, but they felt older, like they'd been standing for centuries instead of decades. I could hear something moving in the walls, not mice or squirrels, footsteps, dozens of them walking in perfect synchronization. Then I heard my name, David. It came from everywhere and nowhere, seeping through the floorboards like water. David, come home. I woke up, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. It was 3:33 a.m. The house was silent except for the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then I heard it. A sound like breathing coming from the heating vent. Deep, rhythmic, patient breathing. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and shined it at the vent. The breathing stopped immediately, but in the silence that followed, I could swear I heard something moving away, down through the walls, getting fainter and fainter until it was just my imagination. Maybe. The next morning, my mom was making breakfast like nothing had happened, but she kept dropping things. Her hands were shaking as she flipped pancakes. When I asked if she was okay, she just stared at me for a long moment. "Did you hear them too?" she whispered. Before I could answer, my dad walked in, looking like he hadn't slept. He had dirt under his fingernails, which was weird because he worked at the bank. He sat down heavily and said, "I think we need to talk about what my father wrote in those journals." That's when I learned about 1943. My grandfather had been 17 when it started. Same pattern. Families disappearing from old houses, open doors, half-eaten meals. But back then, 28 people vanished before anyone figured out the connection. They were all descendants of the original Roanoke settlers, the ones who'd built their homes over the old sacred grounds. The Monacan tribe warned them, my dad said, reading from one of Grandfather's journals. They said the land was cursed, that every 44 years, the earth would call back what was taken. 44 years, 1943 to 1987. 44 years exactly. My dad showed me a map my grandfather had drawn. Red X's marked the houses where people had vanished in 1943. I compared it to the recent disappearances. Same houses, different families, but the exact same properties. Grandpa thought he'd stopped it, my dad continued. He and some others, they sealed the tunnel entrances, poured concrete into every opening they could find, but he trailed off, looking at our kitchen floor. I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice water. There were footprints in ash, just like at the Johnson house, leading from the basement door to the kitchen table. Fresh footprints, even though none of us had been in the basement since yesterday. That's when we heard Scout start howling again. But Scout was at the animal shelter. The Johnsons had been gone for a week. I looked out the window. There was a beagle in the Johnsons' backyard, pawing at their basement door. It looked exactly like Scout. But when it turned to look at me, its eyes reflected light like a cat's. And I swear it smiled. What I didn't tell you about July 15th was that I wasn't the only one who saw things that shouldn't exist. There were others. People who lived on the fringes of what was happening, close enough to see but far enough to be dismissed. Tommy Breslin was one of them. He was 15, lived 3 blocks over, and delivered newspapers every morning at 4 a.m. On July 14th, he came into the hardware store looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His paper bag was still slung over his shoulder, but it was empty. Papers scattered who knows where. "Mr. Mills," he said, his voice cracking. "Can I talk to you?" In private, I took him to the back room, between the paint cans and bags of cement. He pulled out a Polaroid camera, the kind with instant film. His hands shook as he showed me what he'd photographed that morning. The first picture showed the Hendricks house on Maple Street. Normal enough, except for the figure standing in the upstairs window. It looked like Mr. Hendricks, but the photo had captured him in a weird double exposure. one image of him in pajamas, looking out, and another translucent image of the same man in clothes from another century, his mouth open in a silent scream. "I thought it was just a bad picture," Tommy whispered. "But then I developed this one." The second photo was worse. Much worse. It showed the empty street in that pre-dawn darkness. But superimposed over the modern asphalt were cobblestones. Old, ancient cobblestones that hadn't existed in Roanoke for over a century. And walking on those stones were dozens of figures in colonial dress, all moving in the same direction, all heading toward the center of town, toward our street. "They didn't see me," Tommy said. "Or maybe they did and didn't care, but Mr. Mills, their feet, they weren't touching the ground. And when I looked without the camera, there was nothing there, just empty street. I bought every roll of film he had left. Told him to document everything he saw, but to be careful. So careful." 3 days later, Tommy's parents reported him missing. His camera was found on the sidewalk outside the Hendricks house. Film exposed, showing only darkness. But Tommy wasn't taken into the earth like the others. 2 weeks after everything ended, he turned up in Richmond, 80 miles away, with no memory of how he got there. The only thing he could remember was the feeling of being watched. And a voice telling him, "Not you, boy. Not yet, but soon." Then there was Dr. Patricia Huang. She'd moved to Roanoke in 1985, bought a practice on Jefferson Street. She didn't believe in anything she couldn't measure, couldn't prove. Until July 17th, she showed up at our house late one night, her medical bag in hand. My dad let her in, confused, and she spread geological survey maps across our kitchen table. Maps she'd requisitioned from the city planning office under the pretense of checking for radon. "The tunnels," she said without preamble. "They're not mining tunnels. Not entirely." She pointed to the survey maps showing the underground structure beneath our neighborhood. The official maps showed sealed mining shafts, yes. But Dr. Huang had done her own ground-penetrating radar survey, and what she'd found didn't match. "These chambers," she traced her finger along a pattern that looked disturbingly organic. "They're too regular, too intentional, and they're not empty." She pulled out printouts from her radar equipment. Grainy, difficult to interpret. But once you knew what you were looking at, you couldn't unsee it. The chambers were filled with something. Something that moved in waves, like breathing. Like the earth itself was alive down there. "The disappearances correlate with increased activity in these chambers," she said. "And the activity, it's spreading. Each house that empties, the chambers underneath extend further, like roots growing." My father had gone pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't just people being taken," Dr. Huang replied. "It's the earth reclaiming territory. Expanding. And if it continues at this rate, by August 1st, the entire downtown will be undermined." She never got to finish her research. On July 19th, Dr. Huang's office was broken into. Not by thieves. Nothing was stolen. But all her equipment was smashed, her files scattered, and on her wall, written in that strange ash substance, "Some doors should stay closed." She left town the next day. But before she went, she came by one last time, pressed a small package into my hands. Inside was a seismograph reading from the night of July 18th. The tremors it recorded weren't random, they were rhythmic, a pattern that repeated every 44 seconds. "It's a heartbeat," she told me. "The earth has a heartbeat under this town, and it's getting stronger. I still have that reading. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and study the pattern. And I remember what she said as she drove away. Whatever's down there, David, it's been waiting a very long time, and I don't think it's done yet." By July 20th, Roanoke was in full panic mode. The FBI had arrived, setting up a command center at the Civic Center downtown. They interviewed everyone on our street, sometimes twice. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, searching for underground chambers. They found the old tunnels, of course, but they'd been sealed since 1943, just like my grandfather's journal said. Or so they thought. I was working late at the hardware store on July 22nd when old Mr. Crawford came in. He was 93, one of the last people alive who remembered 1943. His hands shook as he grabbed my arm. "You're Paul Mills's grandson, aren't you?" he asked. When I nodded, he pulled me close. His breath smelled like mothballs and fear. "Your grandfather didn't seal all the tunnels, boy. He couldn't. Some of them, they weren't meant to be found by people like us. He bought 3 boxes of salt, 5 packages of iron nails, and every candle we had in stock. As he left, he turned back and said, 'When you hear them calling your real name, the one written in the old records, don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer.'" I didn't know what he meant about my real name. Not then. That night, the dreams got worse. I wasn't alone in them anymore. My parents were there, and my sister who was home from college. We were all walking through our house, but it was different. Older. The walls were made of logs, and I could smell wood smoke and tallow candles. In the dream, we walked to the basement door. It was open, and there were stairs going down. But they went down much further than our basement. Down and down, carved into living rock, lit by a phosphorescent glow that hurt to look at. At the bottom, there were people waiting. They looked like us, exactly like us, but their clothes were from another century. And their eyes were black, completely black, like pools of oil. The one that looked like me smiled and said, "Welcome home, Nathaniel." Nathaniel, that wasn't my name, but somehow, in the dream, I knew it had been once. Long ago. In 1587, I woke up at 3:33 a.m. again. My parents and sister were standing in my doorway, fully dressed. My mom was holding a suitcase I'd never seen before, old leather with brass clasps. "It's time," my father said. "They're calling us home." I tried to speak, to tell them to stop, but my mouth wouldn't work. They turned and walked down the hall. I fought to move, to scream, anything. Finally, I managed to throw myself out of bed. By the time I reached the hallway, they were already at the basement door. "Don't!" I managed to croak. My sister turned back. For a moment, her eyes flickered between normal and that terrible black. "You can fight it," she whispered. "You're not really one of us. Grandpa made sure. The adoption papers. Check the adoption papers." Then they walked through the basement door and were gone. Not down the stairs. Through the door. Like it was made of mist. I sat there in the hallway until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to look. When the sun finally came up, I opened the basement door. Normal stairs, normal basement, but on the concrete floor, 3 sets of footprints in ash, walking to the center of the room and disappearing into solid concrete. The adoption papers were in my dad's office safe. David Mills, adopted April 3rd, 1964. Birth parents unknown. But there was something else. A note in my grandfather's handwriting. "The bloodline ends with us. This child carries no curse. He is our hope." I understood then. The missing families, they weren't random. They were all descendants of the original lost colony. The ones who'd disappeared from Roanoke Island in 1587 and somehow ended up here, in what would become Roanoke, Virginia. Every 44 years, something called them back. Something that lived in the spaces between the limestone, in the tunnels that existed before humans walked this land. But I wasn't blood. I was chosen specifically because I wasn't. By July 30th, 63 people had vanished. The FBI had evacuated 3 blocks around the epicenter, which happened to be our street. but I refused to leave. I knew what my grandfather had done, and I knew what I had to do. In his final journal entry dated October 31st, 1943, my grandfather wrote, "The seal is temporary. The blood debt remains. In 44 years, they will call again. Someone outside the bloodline must close the final door, the one that opens from below, the one that can only be seen by those who don't belong." But there was more in that journal. Pages I hadn't shown my father. Pages that made my hands shake when I first read them. My grandfather had gone down into those tunnels in 1943. He'd seen what waited at the bottom, and he'd made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. "I found them," he wrote in shaky handwriting. "The 28 who vanished, they were alive, if you can call it that. Standing in perfect rows in a chamber that shouldn't exist. Their eyes were black as coal, and they spoke in unison, reciting names. Names of people who wouldn't be born for decades. Names of their children, their grandchildren. My name, my son's name, and a name they hadn't spoken yet, David. He'd known about me before I was born, or rather, he'd known I would need to exist. I sealed what I could," the entry continued. "But the entity, it let me. It was amused by my futility. It told me the seals would hold for exactly one generation, 44 years, the same span of years between the lost colony's disappearance and when the first settler built a home on this cursed ground. It's all connected, all of it. A cycle that began in 1587 and will continue until someone breaks it properly." The final paragraph was the worst. I left something down there, a part of myself, a promise, that someone of my blood would return, but not to be taken, to choose. The entity respects choice above all else. It feeds on obligation, on debt, on the chains that bind bloodlines. But a choice freely made? That's power it can't touch. That's how we win. I understood then why he'd arranged my adoption, why he'd been so specific in his instructions. I wasn't just a shield. I was a weapon. The only thing that could hurt something that fed on inherited guilt. The evening of August 1st, I received an unexpected visitor, Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI. But she wasn't there in an official capacity. She came alone, after dark, without her badge. "My grandmother was one of the 28 who vanished in 1943, she said quietly, standing on my porch. "She came back, but she was never the same. She used to wake up screaming about the ones who wait below. The Bureau doesn't know I'm here, but I've been going through old case files. This has happened before, Mr. Mills. Not just in 1943, 1899, 1855, 1811. Every 44 years, going back to when this town was founded." She handed me a file folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, witness statements, all describing the same pattern, the same ash footprints, the same 3:33 a.m. occurrences. In 1899, a man named Thomas Whitmore went into the tunnels, Agent Chen said. He came back, and the disappearances stopped. But according to his diary, which the Bureau confiscated from his estate, he didn't close the door. He postponed it. He made a deal. "What kind of deal?" I asked. Though I already knew, the entity wanted recognition. It wanted to be remembered. So every 44 years it takes its tribute, until someone offers it something better, until someone offers it a sacrifice made from love instead of obligation. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Your grandfather tried, but he couldn't do it. He was bound by blood, by guilt. He couldn't make a free choice. None of them could. That's why it keeps happening. That's why it needs you." I spent 3 days preparing. Salt circles around the house, iron nails driven into every doorframe. And something else Mr. Crawford had slipped me before he left town. An old Monacan prayer written phonetically on a piece of deerskin. On the night of August 2nd, exactly 44 years after my grandfather's last entry, I went to the basement. The concrete floor looked solid, but when I spoke the Monacan words, cracks appeared. Not random cracks, but symbols, patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. The ash footprints of my family glowed faintly in the dark. Then the floor opened, not breaking, not crumbling, just opening. Like an eye. The stairs were there, like in my dream, but now I could see them for what they really were. Not carved stone, but something organic, like the inside of a throat. The phosphorescent light pulsed like a heartbeat. I descended. Each step felt like pushing through thick water. The air grew dense, ancient, full of whispers and languages that predated words. At the bottom, they were waiting. All of them. The 63 who'd vanished. The 28 from 1943, and others, hundreds of others, stretching back in a line that disappeared into darkness. All standing perfectly still, their black eyes reflecting that sick light. My family was at the front, but they weren't my family anymore. They were wearing clothes from 1587, and their faces were both familiar and impossibly old. "Nathaniel," they said in unison, "you've come home." "My name is David," I said, and my voice echoed strangely like it was coming from somewhere else. "David Mills, son of Paul Mills, grandson of James Mills, and I am not yours." They tilted their heads, all of them, at exactly the same angle, like puppets on a single string. "All debts must be paid," they said. "The land demands its due." That's when I understood the final truth. They weren't being taken. They were being reclaimed. The original colonist had made a bargain, trading their humanity for survival, becoming something else. Something that belonged more to the earth beneath than the world above. Every 44 years, their descendants were called back to fulfill that ancient promise. But I wasn't a descendant. I was an anomaly, a break in the pattern. "Then take me instead," I said. "One for all. An outsider's blood to pay the debt." The darkness around us shifted. Considered. Then something spoke. Not them, but through them. A voice like grinding stone and flowing water. "You offer yourself freely?" "I do. You who carry no debt? To save those who do." There was a pause that lasted forever and an instant. The bargain is acceptable. The black drained from their eyes. My parents, my sister, all of them gasped like drowning people breaking the surface. They looked around in confusion, terror, recognition flooding their faces. "Run," I told them. "All of you. Run." They ran, stumbling, crying, helping each other up those terrible stairs. I stayed, watching them go, feeling the darkness pressing in, waiting to claim its modified prize. But as the last person reached the top, something unexpected happened. The voice spoke again, almost amused. "You would die for those who lied to you? Who used you as a shield against their own fate?" I thought about that. About the adoption. The grand plan to have someone immune to the curse. "Yes," I said simply, "because that's what makes me human. The choice to save others, even when they don't deserve it." The darkness laughed, or maybe it was crying. It's hard to tell with sounds that old. "Then go," it said. "The debt is paid in full. Your sacrifice, offered but not taken, breaks the chain. There will be no more callings. The doorway closes forever." I ran, then. The stairs were crumbling behind me, the phosphorescent light dying. I burst through the basement floor just as it sealed itself, leaving nothing but solid concrete and the faint smell of ash. The FBI found all 63 missing people wandering downtown at dawn, confused but unharmed. They had no memory of where they'd been. The official story was mass hysteria, a gas leak, a shared delusion. The town believed it because they needed to. My family never spoke of that night. We moved away from Roanoke that fall. But sometimes I catch my sister staring at nothing, and I know she remembers something. And sometimes, late at night, my parents stand at their bedroom window, looking back the way we came. Mr. Crawford sent me a letter before he died. Just 2 words: well done. I kept one of my grandfather's journals, the one where he wrote about the future, about the next calling that would have been in 2031. But that won't happen now. The cycle is broken, the door is closed. Or at least that's what I tell myself. Because last week I got a call from my sister. She bought a house, a beautiful old colonial place built in 1919 in Salem, Massachusetts, and she's been having the strangest dreams. But that's a different story, one I hope I never have to tell. Although, if you've made it this far, listening in your bed late at night, maybe check your locks again. And if you live in an old house, especially one built before 1920, and if you've been having dreams about people who look familiar but wrong, well, maybe don't answer when they call your name. Sweet dreams. If you're still awake after that, tell me in the comments. What would you have done in that basement? Would you have offered yourself to save the others? And has anyone else noticed how many old houses in their town were built before 1920? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear what happened in Salem, because that story might be even worse. Sleep tight.